General Patton wasn't the bloodthirsty warmonger history books make him out to be. That single claim cuts hard against the grain of everything most of us absorbed from school textbooks, war documentaries, and the famous film that still dominates public memory. The man with the ivory-handled pistols, the polished helmet, the scowl practiced in mirrors, and the stream of profanity that could strip paint from a tank has been locked into the popular imagination as a pure instrument of aggression. Old blood and guts, the general who seemed to love war a little too much, who slapped soldiers in hospital tents, who raced across Europe as if the only thing that mattered was the next kill and the next headline. Yet the real George Smith Patton Jr. refuses to stay inside that frame. He was a far more complicated figure, one whose legend has always been easier to sell than his actual character ever was. What was he really like? That is the question worth asking if we want more than the poster version. Patton remains one of the most recognizable American commanders of the Second World War, a name that still evokes speed, daring, and unapologetic toughness. His Third Army covered more ground, captured more territory, and inflicted heavier losses on the enemy in less time than almost any other comparable force on the Western Front. The image of the hard-charging warrior is not invented out of thin air. It is, however, radically incomplete. Behind the theatrical exterior lived a man of striking and often uncomfortable contradictions, a dyslexic who became one of the most serious students of military history in the American officer corps, a poet who wrote repeatedly about death and destiny, a devout Christian who firmly believed he had already lived and died as a warrior across multiple earlier ages, a leader who could drive men to the edge of physical and mental exhaustion and then break down in tears among the wounded. The surface we've been sold is loud, simple, and useful for storytelling. The man underneath was neither loud in private nor simple in any respect. The problem is that history, popular culture, and even some serious writing have preferred the cartoons. One version paints Patton as the brilliant, aggressive genius whose only real flaw was that the cautious politicians and staff officers around him could not keep up with his pace. In this telling, he is the natural warrior, the man born for the exact moment when democracy needed someone willing to fight without hesitation or excessive concern for appearances. The opposing cartoon is darker and almost equally common. The unstable hothead, the glory seeker whose temper and ego nearly cost him everything more than once. The officer whose methods would be unacceptable in any modern army, and whose battlefield success owed as much to superior American logistics and industrial power as to any special personal gift. Both versions flatten him into something manageable. Both are useful for argument, for entertainment, or for moral lessons. Neither accounts for the full historical record or the full human being who left that record. The real challenge is to peel back those layers and sit with the contradictions without rushing to resolve them. Patton was capable of operational brilliance that still impresses professional soldiers studying the campaigns of 1944 and 1945, and of impulsive cruelty that still shocks readers when they encounter the hospital incidents in detail. He could deliver a speech so raw, so vulgar, and so precisely calibrated to the fears and pride of ordinary soldiers that it left hardened troops laughing and ready to fight, then later write verses that reveal a mind deeply preoccupied with the meaning of repeated death and rebirth. He demanded iron discipline and absolute accountability from subordinates, yet he also understood the psychological weight of prolonged combat in ways that sometimes left him emotionally exposed and almost fragile. He cultivated a public persona so carefully and so consistently that it became a kind of armor and a kind of prison, while privately filling diaries with self-examination, frustration, flashes of vulnerability, and occasional flashes of genuine insight into his own limitations. To understand him is not to choose a side between hero and villain, or between genius and madman. It is to hold both sets of facts at once and accept that a single human being could contain them without collapsing into incoherence. That fuller picture begins in his early life and the forces that shaped him long before the Second World War made him famous. Born on 11 November 1885 into a wealthy California family with deep military roots on both sides, Patton grew up surrounded by stories of Confederate ancestors and martial glory. His grandfather and great-uncle had fought and died for the Confederacy. John Singleton Mosby, the famous Confederate guerrilla, was a frequent visitor to the family home and told the boy stories that left a permanent mark. From earliest childhood, Patton was read to extensively and repeatedly. Homer, the Bible for hours at a stretch, accounts of Alexander the Great, Napoleon, the medieval knights, and the American Civil War. Formal schooling started late because reading and writing came with extreme, almost crippling difficulty. What later generations would recognize without hesitation as dyslexia led the young Patton to decide with painful certainty that he was simply stupid. That private judgment never completely left him. It became a driving force behind an almost obsessive need to prove himself through physical courage, relentless study, and the deliberate construction of a commanding public self that no one could dismiss as weak or ordinary. He spent a year at the Virginia Military Institute before transferring to the United States Military Academy at West Point, where academic struggles forced him to repeat his first year. The experience was humiliating and formative. He competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, finishing 5th overall despite a disappointing performance in the pistol event that cost him a medal. In 1916, he rode with a punitive expedition into Mexico after Pancha Villa, gaining early combat experience, designing a new cavalry saber that bore his name, and beginning to build the personal legend of the flamboyant, hard-riding officer. During the First World War, he was among the first American officers to work seriously with tanks, recognizing their potential when many of his peers still thought in terms of horses and trenches. Near Shepee in September 1918, he was wounded while leading an attack. In the moments that followed, he later described a vivid and lasting sense of his ancestors watching him from a cloud above the German lines. He arose, called for volunteers, and advanced into fire, telling himself it was time for another Patton to die. The episode reinforced a conviction already forming in him with unusual force, that death was not final, only another passage in a long series of lives spent as a fighter. Between the wars, he studied with an intensity unusual for an American officer of his generation and rank. He wrote detailed articles arguing for the importance of armored mobility, combined arms, and aggressive exploitation of breakthroughs at a time when much of the United States Army still looked backward toward the lessons of 1918 or even earlier. He also wrote poetry, dozens of poems across the years, many of them circling obsessively around themes of war, mortality, glory, and destiny. The most revealing is Through a Glass, Darkly, composed in the early 1920s. In it, Patton catalogs earlier existences with a kind of calm certainty: a prehistoric hunter stalking mammoth, a soldier in the Persian Wars, a fighter at the siege of Tyre under Alexander the Great, a Roman facing the Parthians, a Viking on the way to Valhalla, an Englishman at Agincourt, a cavalryman riding with Napoleon. Always male, always a warrior, always dying and returning to fight again. Close friends and family confirmed that this was not a literary device or romantic pose. Patton believed it. He spoke of remembering places he had never visited in this life and of knowing the smell of ancient battlefields with their unwashed bodies and congealing blood. Death, he maintained repeatedly, held little terror because he had already walked through that door many times. The belief gave him a kind of fatalistic courage that served him well under fire. It also fed a powerful and sometimes dangerous sense of personal destiny, that he had been prepared across centuries for the precise moment when his country would again need a pure warrior, and that he was, in some sense, destined to lead. His leadership style grew directly from these inner sources and from a deliberate theory of command. He believed a commander must be seen and must be unmistakable. The immaculate uniform, the high riding boots, the ivory-handled pistols — he hated the common description of them as pearl-handled — the carefully cultivated scowl he practiced in mirrors, all were deliberate tools of presence and psychological effect. He wanted his presence to be felt at the front so that soldiers would know the general shared their risks and expected the same standards he imposed on himself. He demanded speed, aggression, continuous pressure on the enemy, and zero tolerance for excuses or delay. At the same time, he visited hospitals repeatedly and at length, sometimes overcome by emotion among the wounded, telling them openly that he wished he had been a better general so fewer of them would be lying there. Subordinates frequently found him terrifying in the moment and still followed him with fierce, almost personal loyalty afterward.
Many later said they hated the constant pressure and the fear of his temper, yet would have gone anywhere with him because they believed he knew how to win and how to keep them alive longer than a more cautious commander. Superiors recognized the rare operational gift and spent considerable energy managing the volatility that came with it. Eisenhower protected him more than once when political and public pressure threatened to end his career, yet never fully trusted his judgment outside the narrow domain of combat command. Bradley respected the results Patton produced and privately found the personality exhausting and the ego difficult to contain. The controversies that still define him for many people arrived with force in Sicily in August 1943. Visiting two separate evacuation hospitals within days of each other, Patton encountered soldiers suffering what was then called battle fatigue or shell shock, conditions we now understand more clearly as post-traumatic stress. He slapped them, cursed them as cowards in front of medical staff and other patients, and in one case waved a pistol and threatened to shoot the man himself if he did not return to the front. The second incident reached the press. Eisenhower, already under pressure, ordered a public apology that Patton had to deliver unit by unit across the 7th Army. The experience was humiliating. Patton's career came within a breath of ending permanently. He was sidelined during the critical planning for the Normandy invasion and used instead as the high-profile decoy commanding the 1st United States Army Group, a deception operation meant to convince the Germans that the main landing would come at the Pas de Calais rather than in Normandy. Other missteps accumulated over time. Political remarks that showed little feel for the realities of democratic governance or the sensitivities of coalition warfare. Diary entries that reflected the prejudices of his class and time, and sometimes went further into territory that remains uncomfortable to read. A tendency, especially after the German surrender, to speak of occupation policy, denazification, and the Soviet Union in ways that alarmed both Washington and his own superiors, and ultimately cost him the command of the Third Army. These were not minor footnotes or the inventions of hostile biographers. They were real failures of judgment that limited his usefulness the moment the pure fighting stopped and the more complicated work of occupation and alliance management began. Yet, the same officer kept detailed private diaries full of reflection and self-criticism, studied history as practical instruction rather than decoration or romantic escape, and demonstrated a sophisticated grasp of logistics, operational deception, and the psychology of both his own troops and the enemy. He understood that speed and continuous pressure could unhinge an opponent more effectively than perfect plans executed slowly. He understood that soldiers would endure extraordinary hardship if they believed their commander shared the risks and knew how to win. The caricature of the bloodthirsty warmonger simply cannot contain these facts. It reduces a complicated intelligence, a complicated temperament, and a complicated inner life into a single, loud, and marketable trait.
The period that most clearly reveals the full paradox of the man came in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. The German army launched its last major offensive in the west through the Ardennes forest in mid-December. American lines cracked under the surprise and the weight of the attack. Bastogne was surrounded. Fog, snow, and bitter cold grounded Allied air power for critical days. In some headquarters, the atmosphere approached genuine panic as the scale of the German penetration became clear. On 19 December, Eisenhower gathered his senior commanders at a conference to decide the response. Most were still absorbing the size of the reverse and the implications for the entire front. Patton arrived already prepared. He had been watching the quiet sector opposite his Third Army with growing suspicion and had privately wargamed the possibility of a major German attack in that area. When asked how soon he could attack northward to relieve the pressure, he answered that he could do so with 3 divisions in 48 hours. An entire army does not casually pivot 90 degrees in the middle of winter, disengage from one active front, march through snow and ice on limited roads, and launch a coordinated counteroffensive against a still dangerous enemy. Patton's staff had already prepared multiple contingency plans in advance. Within days, the 4th Armored Division was moving on a scale and at a speed that astonished even those who knew him well.
On 26 December, elements of the 4th Armored Division broke the siege of Bastogne and linked up with the defenders. The maneuver remains one of the most impressive operational achievements of the war in Europe. Speed, detailed preparation under pressure, audacity, and sustained drive under extreme weather and combat conditions. Soldiers who took part later said the army seemed to advance by the sheer force of his will and his refusal to accept the ordinary limits of what an army could do in winter. The same stretch of weeks also showed the other Patton without disguise. He continued to deliver crude and sometimes inflammatory remarks. He chafed openly at what he regarded as excessive caution from higher headquarters. He ordered a public prayer for clear weather so his aircraft could fly in support. When the weather finally broke, he was quick to note the apparent divine answer and to claim it as evidence of favor. His diary kept recording both sharp strategic insight into the German situation and personal grievances about recognition, resources, and the shortcomings of other commanders. The brilliance and the flaws moved together without separation or resolution. That is the central tension that defines him. The same inner intensity that produced the rapid, decisive, and almost impossible pivot of an entire army in the dead of winter also produced the hospital incidents in Sicily and the political clumsiness that followed the German surrender. The belief that he was a warrior returning across centuries gave him the courage to accept enormous risks and the certainty that made those risks feel like destiny rather than recklessness. It also left him impatient with any reality that refused to fit a strict warrior code, including the invisible psychological wounds of his own soldiers, the requirements of coalition diplomacy, and the complicated politics of a democracy fighting a total war while preparing for an uncertain peace. Genius and human failing were not sequential stages in Patton's life that could be separated for convenience. They were simultaneous and inseparable. When the easy cartoons are finally set aside, what remains is a complex individual who cannot be neatly categorized or reduced to a single trait. He was never simply the bloodthirsty warmonger of popular memory, nor was he a pure strategic visionary free of serious and recurring flaws. His methods were often controversial, sometimes indefensible by any reasonable standard, and rooted in a worldview that struggled to adapt once the pure fighting stopped and the messier work of occupation and alliance management began. At the same time, his impact on the military history of the Second World War is difficult to overstate and remains undeniable. The speed, aggression, and operational daring he brought to the Third Army shortened the fighting in Western Europe, forced the German army into repeated crises, and almost certainly saved lives, even as his personal conduct sometimes endangered his own career and the morale of those around him. Holding both truths at once is harder than choosing a side and declaring the matter settled. It is also the only way to see the man clearly and honestly. The legend is useful for posters, for movie trailers, and for simple moral stories. The real Patton, contradictory, driven, intellectually serious in his own way, emotionally volatile, operationally gifted, and permanently unfinished, is the one worth understanding if we care about the actual history rather than the myth.